The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the opulent dining room of Blackwood Hall as Catherine Moore carefully balanced the heavy silver tray, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tonight's dinner party represented the pinnacle of London society. Cabinet ministers, foreign ambassadors, and the most influential families in England gathered around Duke Nathaniel Blackwood's mahogany table. One misstep, one broken piece of the priceless Sèvres china, and she would be dismissed without reference. At 25, Catherine had learned to move like a ghost through the grand houses of the wealthy, invisible except when needed, silent except when spoken to. Her auburn hair was severely pinned beneath her cap, her hazel eyes downcast as she served the elaborate courses that marked another display of aristocratic excess in this autumn of 1851. "More wine, Lord Pemberton," she murmured, approaching the portly gentleman whose face had grown increasingly flushed with each glass. "About time," Lord Pemberton slurred, his pudgy fingers reaching not for his glass, but for Catherine's wrist as she leaned forward to pour. "Pretty little thing, aren't you? What do you say we—" Catherine jerked away instinctively, causing a drop of wine to splash onto the pristine white tablecloth. The crimson stain spread like blood across the fabric, and suddenly every conversation ceased. 20 pairs of aristocratic eyes fixed upon her with the predatory attention of wolves scenting weakness. "Clumsy creature," Lady Pemberton sniffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "Really, Your Grace, where do you find these servants? One would think you could afford better quality help." A ripple of cruel laughter circled the table. Catherine's cheeks burned with humiliation as she quickly dabbed at the stain with her napkin, knowing that drawing attention to herself was the cardinal sin of domestic service. "Perhaps," drawled the Duke of Somerset, a thin man with cruel eyes and a reputation for malicious wit. "She's been sampling the wine herself. Tell me, girl, do you often indulge in your betters' refreshments?" "No, Your Lordship," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible above the renewed laughter. "I beg your pardon for my clumsiness." "Clumsiness?" Lady Hastings, Somerset's wife, leaned forward with theatrical interest. "Or perhaps incompetence born of inferior breeding. One can always tell good blood, you know. Look at those hands, rough as a washwoman's. Clearly born to scrub floors, not serve gentlemen." Catherine's hands trembled as the cruelty escalated around her. These people, draped in silk and dripping with jewels, seemed to find genuine pleasure in her degradation. She had served in great houses since she was 17, when her father's death had left her family penniless, but never had she encountered such casual viciousness. "I say," Lord Pemberton continued, emboldened by the attention, "perhaps we should examine her references. I'll wager she's run from her last position under questionable circumstances. They always do, these servant girls." Duke Nathaniel Blackwood sat at the head of his table, his steel blue eyes observing the scene, with an expression as cold and unreadable as winter stone. At 34, he commanded respect through sheer presence. Tall, dark-haired, and bearing the kind of masculine beauty that made society mothers push their daughters forward, while simultaneously fearing his reportedly ruthless nature in business and politics. Catherine had served in his household for 6 months, without exchanging more than necessary pleasantries with the Duke. He was known for his exacting standards, his brilliant political mind, and his complete emotional detachment from everything except the advancement of his family's interests. She had no reason to expect mercy from such a man when his guests demanded entertainment at her expense. "Your Grace," Somerset called out, raising his glass in mock salute, "surely you must have some amusing stories about your domestic staff. We've all heard tales of the shocking things servants get up to when they think no one is watching." The laughter grew louder, more pointed. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes as the humiliation deepened. She wanted to flee, to escape the crushing weight of their collective scorn, but her feet remained rooted to the Persian carpet as if fear had turned her limbs to stone. "Tell us," Lady Pemberton demanded with malicious glee, "what sins has this one committed? Has she been reading your books, trying on your daughter's dresses, or perhaps—" her voice dropped to a theatrical whisper that carried clearly through the room, "she's been harboring inappropriate thoughts about her betters." Catherine's face went white as the accusation hit home with devastating accuracy. Not inappropriate thoughts about her employer in a romantic sense, but something perhaps worse in their eyes. She had indeed been reading, teaching herself from discarded newspapers and borrowed books, dreaming of a world beyond service. The hunger for knowledge that had once been fed by her father's library was now a guilty secret she pursued in stolen moments. Catherine began, but her voice cracked under the weight of their staring eyes. "She can't even defend herself properly," Lord Pemberton declared triumphantly. "Mark my words, Your Grace, you've got a schemer in your midst. These quiet ones always are, probably listening at keyholes, stealing silverware, or worse." The accusations flew like arrows, each one designed to wound and humiliate. Catherine stood trapped in the center of their attention, a fox surrounded by hounds who had found sport in her terror. She had committed no crime beyond being born poor, and having the misfortune to spill wine in front of people who viewed her humanity as negotiable. Duke Nathaniel had remained silent throughout the escalating cruelty, his face an impenetrable mask that revealed nothing of his thoughts. His fingers drummed once against the table, the only sign that he was even paying attention to his guests' entertainment. But as Catherine swayed slightly on her feet, overwhelmed by the vicious assault on her character and dignity, something shifted in the Duke's expression. His steel blue eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read the dangerous currents that ran beneath aristocratic civility. Duke Nathaniel Blackwood was no longer merely observing his guest's cruelty. He was measuring it. The torment of Catherine continued to escalate as the dinner guests, emboldened by what they perceived as the Duke's tacit approval of their sport, grew increasingly creative in their cruelty. Lady Hastings had begun a detailed critique of Catherine's appearance, pointing out every perceived flaw with the precision of a scientist examining a specimen. "Look at that posture," she declared to the table at large. "Absolutely no breeding whatsoever. A proper servant should know how to hold herself with dignity, even in disgrace. This creature slouches like a common tavern wench." "Perhaps," Somerset suggested with malicious glee, "we should test her education. Can you read, girl? Write your own name? Or are you as illiterate as you appear?" Catherine's secret shame burned in her throat. She could indeed read and write, better than many ladies of society, but admitting such accomplishments would only fuel their accusations of reaching beyond her station. "Answer his lordship," Lady Pemberton commanded sharply. "Or has fear robbed you of speech as well as grace?" "I can read, my lady," Catherine whispered, immediately regretting her honesty as triumphant smiles spread across several faces. "Ah," Somerset pounced on her admission like a cat on a mouse. "So you do fancy yourself educated. Tell me, what books have you been reading? Poetry, perhaps? Novels? Or have you been perusing your betters' correspondence?" The questioning had taken a sinister turn. In an age where knowledge was considered a privilege of the upper classes, a servant who read was automatically suspect of social climbing, espionage, or worse. Catherine realized with growing horror that her honesty had only deepened the trap closing around her. I read only what is proper, your lordship. Scripture and—" she faltered, knowing that any answer would be twisted against her. "Scripture," Lady Pemberton laughed harshly. "How convenient. The refuge of every scheming servant who wishes to appear virtuous. I'll wager you've been reading far more scandalous material, haven't you?" Duke Nathaniel's fingers had ceased their drumming, and his attention was now focused with laser intensity on the scene unfolding before him. Something in his stillness spoke of a predator gathering itself to strike, but his guests remained oblivious to the danger they were courting. Lord Pemberton, growing bolder with wine and the crowd's encouragement, rose unsteadily from his chair. "Your Grace, if I may suggest, perhaps this servant requires a more thorough examination of her character. These reading servants are often thieves as well. Should we not search her quarters for stolen items?" The suggestion sent a chill through Catherine's entire body. A search of her small attic room would reveal the collection of books she had carefully accumulated over the years, novels, poetry, even political treatises borrowed from libraries and copied by hand. In the eyes of these people, such possessions would be proof of criminal ambition and inappropriate desires. "An excellent suggestion," Somerset agreed, his cruel eyes gleaming with anticipation. "What say you, your Grace? Shall we investigate what treasures this literate servant has accumulated in your house?" For the first time since the ordeal began, Duke Nathaniel spoke. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but something in its tone made every person at the table suddenly uneasy. "What an interesting proposal, Somerset. Tell me, what exactly do you hope to find in Miss Moore's quarters?" Catherine's heart leapt at the unexpected use of her name. In 6 months of service, she had never heard it pass the Duke's lips, and hearing it now, spoken with such careful precision, sent an inexplicable shiver through her. Somerset, missing the warning entirely, puffed up with self-importance. Evidence of her true character, Your Grace. These educated servants are invariably thieves, blackmailers, or worse. They use their unnatural learning to prey upon their betters' trust. Unnatural learning, Duke Nathaniel repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. How fascinating. And what, in your estimation, constitutes natural learning for someone in Miss Moore's position? The question hung in the air like a blade. Somerset, finally sensing that the conversation had taken an unexpected turn, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, that is to say, her servant should know only what is necessary for her duties. Reading and writing are luxuries that lead to dangerous ideas above their station. I see. Duke Nathaniel's steel-blue eyes swept the table, taking in each face with the methodical attention of a general surveying a battlefield. And who precisely determines what constitutes a person's proper station in life? Lady Hastings laughed nervously. Why, birth, of course. Breeding. The natural order that has governed civilized society for centuries. The natural order, Duke Nathaniel mused. How convenient that this natural order places each of you in positions of comfort and authority, while condemning others to lives of service, based solely on the circumstances of their birth. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree. Even the servants standing along the walls sensed the shift in atmosphere, though they dared not raise their eyes to witness whatever drama was unfolding among their betters. Lord Pemberton, too drunk to recognize the danger, attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Your Grace surely agrees that maintaining proper social distinctions is essential. When servants forget their place, chaos follows. Chaos, Duke Nathaniel repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I suppose chaos would follow if we began judging people by their character, rather than their bloodlines, if we evaluated worth based on intelligence, kindness, and moral courage, rather than accident of birth. Terribly chaotic indeed. Catherine stood frozen, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. The Duke's words seemed to defend not just her, but the very principle that had been under attack all evening, that human worth might be measured by something other than social position. Somerset, finally realizing that their host was not joining their sport but rather challenging it, attempted to retreat with dignity intact. Your Grace, we meant no offense. We were merely concerned for your household's welfare. Were you? Duke Nathaniel's voice cut through Somerset's explanation like a blade through silk. How thoughtful. Tell me, what qualifies you to evaluate Miss Moore's character or conduct? Experience, Your Grace. Knowledge of the world. Understanding of proper social order. Understanding of proper social order. Duke Nathaniel rose slowly from his chair, his imposing height suddenly seeming to fill the room. Let me share with you my understanding of proper social order, Somerset. The Duke moved with deliberate grace around the table until he stood directly behind Catherine's chair. She could feel the warmth of his presence like a shield at her back, though she still dared not look up from the stained tablecloth before her. My understanding, he continued in that same deceptively quiet voice, is that true nobility lies in protecting those who cannot protect themselves, that honor consists of using one's position to uplift rather than crush, that a gentleman's worth is measured not by his ability to humiliate the vulnerable, but by his courage in defending them. The silence that followed was so complete that the ticking of the mantel clock seemed to echo like thunder through the room. Every guest sat frozen, suddenly aware that they had badly misjudged their host's character and were now facing the consequences of their error. Furthermore, Duke Nathaniel continued, his voice gaining an edge of steel that made several ladies reach for their fans. I find it curious that grown men and women of supposed breeding would find entertainment in tormenting a young woman whose only crime appears to be competent service to my household. Lady Pemberton's face had gone white beneath her rouge. Your Grace, we never intended— Oh, but you did intend, the Duke interrupted smoothly. Every word, every gesture, every cruel laugh was quite intentional. The question now is what I intend to do about it. The tension in the dining room had become so thick that even the flames in the fireplace seemed to flicker more cautiously. Duke Nathaniel's guests sat in various states of discomfort, suddenly aware that their evening's entertainment had transformed into something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Catherine remained motionless, her mind reeling from the unexpected turn of events. In all her years of service, she had never witnessed a member of the nobility defend a servant, much less challenge their peers over the treatment of domestic help. The very foundation of her understanding about her place in the world was crumbling beneath her feet. Your Grace, Lord Pemberton attempted weakly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Perhaps we have been somewhat spirited in our conversation. No real harm was intended." Duke Nathaniel's cold smile held no warmth whatsoever. "No real harm? How reassuring. Miss Moore, have you been harmed by tonight's spirited conversation?" For the first time since the ordeal began, Catherine was directly addressed by someone other than her tormentors. She raised her eyes tentatively to meet the Duke's gaze, expecting to see the same cruel amusement that had characterized the evening. Instead, she found something that made her breath catch in her throat, genuine concern, and beneath it, a carefully controlled fury that was all the more intimidating for being held in check. Catherine's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I am quite well, Your Grace. Are you?" His steel-blue eyes seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed composure to the pain and humiliation beneath. "Because from where I stand, you appear to have been subjected to a sustained attack on your character, your intelligence, your integrity, and your very humanity. Would you call that quite well?" Catherine's throat worked convulsively as she struggled to find an appropriate response. To agree with his assessment would be to criticize his guests, an unthinkable breach of protocol that could cost her position. To disagree would be to deny the obvious truth of what had occurred. Somerset, sensing an opportunity to regain some ground, leaned forward with what he hoped was a conciliatory smile. "Your Grace, surely you understand that we were merely engaging in the sort of light conversation that often accompanies dinner parties. No malice was intended toward your servant." "Light conversation," Duke Nathaniel repeated, his tone suggesting he found the description fascinating. "I see. Tell me, Somerset, would you consider it light conversation if I were to question your wife's breeding, her intelligence, her moral character, and her right to occupy a place in civilized society?" Lady Hastings gasped audibly, her fan snapping open with a sharp crack. "Your Grace, the comparison is hardly appropriate, isn't it?" The Duke's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "Please enlighten me as to the distinction. What makes Lady Hastings inherently more deserving of respect than Miss Moore?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. To answer it honestly would require acknowledging that their treatment of Catherine had been based solely on her social position rather than any actual failing on her part. To refuse to answer would be to admit the indefensibility of their behavior. Lady Pemberton attempted to navigate the treacherous waters with what she hoped was diplomatic tact. "Your Grace, surely the differences in station and breeding are obvious to any person of quality. The natural distinctions that govern society—" "Natural distinctions," Duke Nathaniel interrupted, his voice now carrying an edge of barely restrained contempt. "How convenient that these natural distinctions always seem to favor those who were born into comfort over those who were born into hardship. Tell me, what natural law decrees that the daughter of a deceased gentleman should be less worthy of courtesy than the wife of a living peer?" Catherine's head snapped up in shock. How did the Duke know about her father's status? In all her months of service, she had never spoken of her background, carefully maintaining the fiction that she was simply another girl from the village seeking employment. The Duke's perceptive gaze caught her surprise and held it for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. "Did you think, Miss Moore, that I would employ someone in my household without knowing exactly who they are?" The revelation sent ripples of unease through the assembled guests. If Duke Nathaniel knew Catherine's background and had still allowed her to be subjected to their cruelty, what did that say about his opinion of their behavior? "Miss Catherine Moore," the Duke announced to the room, his voice carrying the authority of a herald proclaiming royal titles, "daughter of the late Reverend William Moore of St. Andrew's Parish, graduate of Miss Pemberton's Academy for Young Ladies, fluent in French and Italian, accomplished in music and literature, and possessor of the finest references from 3 previous positions in households of impeccable reputation." Each revelation fell like a stone into still water, sending shockwaves through the dining room. Catherine Moore was not the ignorant village girl they had assumed, but a gentlewoman fallen on hard times, exactly the sort of person their own daughters might become if fortune turned against their families. Lord Pemberton's face had gone ashen. "Your Grace, if you had known what?" The Duke's interruption was swift and merciless. "If you had known she was educated, you would have treated her with respect? If you had known she was born a gentleman's daughter, you would have shown her courtesy? How enlightening. So your behavior toward other human beings is determined entirely by their social credentials, rather than their inherent worth as people." Somerset made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Oh, Your Grace, we meant no disrespect to your household or your judgment." "No," Duke Nathaniel said with finality that brooked no argument. "You meant to amuse yourselves at the expense of someone you perceived as powerless to defend herself. You meant to demonstrate your superiority by degrading another human being. You meant to transform a young woman's honest labor into a source of public humiliation for your entertainment." The Duke moved to stand directly beside Catherine's chair, his presence forming a physical barrier between her and his guests. "What you did not mean to do, apparently, was consider that your host might judge you by the same standards you apply to others, that your character might be evaluated based on how you treat those who cannot retaliate against you, that your worth as human beings might be measured by your capacity for kindness rather than your capacity for cruelty." Lady Hastings attempted to rise from her chair, clearly desperate to escape the increasingly uncomfortable situation. "Your Grace, perhaps we should—" "Sit down." The command was delivered with such quiet authority that Lady Hastings immediately sank back into her seat, as if her strings had been cut. Duke Nathaniel's steel-blue eyes swept the table one final time, taking in each face with the methodical precision of a judge pronouncing sentence. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute decree. "You have all enjoyed an evening of sport at Miss Moore's expense. Now it is time for you to understand what true entertainment looks like from the other side." Catherine felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. Whatever the Duke intended, she sensed it would be devastating for his guests, and potentially dangerous for her own future. She was about to become either a protected witness or a casualty in whatever justice Duke Nathaniel Blackwood deemed appropriate for those who had transformed his dining room into a theatre of cruelty. The reckoning was about to begin. What followed was perhaps the most methodical dismantling of aristocratic pretension that London society had ever witnessed within the confines of a private dining room. Duke Nathaniel did not raise his voice, did not resort to crude insults, but instead employed the surgical precision of perfect breeding turned to devastating purpose. "Lord Pemberton," he began conversationally, "you spoke extensively tonight about proper breeding and the importance of recognizing quality in one's inferiors. I find myself curious about your own qualifications for such judgment." Lord Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly sensing a trap but unable to identify its nature. "Your Grace, I merely spoke from experience and natural discernment." "Natural discernment," the Duke mused. "How fascinating. Tell me, was it this same natural discernment that led you to invest your wife's inheritance in the South Sea bubble scheme 5 years ago? The same discernment that has required you to quietly sell off 3 of your estates to cover gambling debts?" Lady Pemberton's face went white as parchment. These financial difficulties had been kept strictly private, known only to the family's closest advisors and creditors. The fact that Duke Nathaniel possessed such intimate knowledge of their affairs was both shocking and terrifying. "I fail to see the relevance," Lord Pemberton began weakly. "The relevance," Duke Nathaniel interrupted smoothly, "is that a man who cannot discern a sound investment from a fraudulent scheme might lack the expertise to discern character in others. But please, continue your assessment of Miss Moore's worthiness to serve in my household." The devastating accuracy of the attack left Lord Pemberton speechless. Around the table, the other guests began to shift nervously, suddenly wondering what private failures might be exposed to public scrutiny. Duke Nathaniel turned his attention to Somerset, who had been the most vicious in his attacks on Catherine's character. "Your lordship spoke eloquently about the dangers of educated servants and the importance of maintaining proper social boundaries. I wonder if you apply these same standards to your own household?" Somerset's eyes darted nervously around the table, clearly recognizing the danger but unable to retreat. "Of course, Your Grace. Proper order must be maintained." "Indeed it must," the Duke agreed pleasantly. "Which makes it puzzling that your own valet, Henderson, has been systematically embezzling from your household accounts for the past 2 years, a total of nearly £300, if my information is correct. Tell me, how does an uneducated servant manage such sophisticated theft? Might it be because he is in fact quite well educated, the natural son of a bankrupt gentleman, as it happens, who could read your ledgers better than you could yourself?" Somerset's mouth worked soundlessly as the devastating revelation sank in. Not only had his most trusted servant been stealing from him, but the theft had been discovered and documented by others while remaining hidden from him, a humiliating testament to his own incompetence. Lady Hastings, realizing that no one was immune from the Duke's surgical exposure of their failures, attempted to excuse herself from the table. "Your Grace, I fear I am feeling quite unwell." "How unfortunate," Duke Nathaniel replied with false sympathy. "Perhaps your illness stems from the same condition that led you to dismiss your last 3 ladies' maids without references. The same mysterious ailment that compels you to accuse innocent women of theft when small items go missing from your dressing room." Lady Hastings's fan clattered to the floor as her hands began to shake. The implications of the Duke's words were clear to everyone present. She had been falsely accusing servants to cover her own misplacing of items, destroying their reputations and futures to avoid admitting her own carelessness. "The small pearl brooch that disappeared last month," Duke Nathaniel continued relentlessly, "was found in the pocket of a coat you had worn to the opera. The silver hairpins you accused your maid of stealing were discovered in your jewelry box, exactly where you had placed them yourself. Yet 3 women lost their positions and their good names because you found it preferable to destroy their reputations rather than admit your errors." Catherine watched in fascination and growing horror as the Duke methodically stripped away the veneer of respectability from each person who had tormented her. These people, who had seemed so confident in their superiority, were revealed to be deeply flawed individuals whose own failures far exceeded any fault they had attributed to her. But even as part of her felt vindicated by their exposure, Catherine began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with the ruthless precision of the Duke's retribution. The power he wielded was awesome and terrible, and she found herself wondering what it might feel like to be on the receiving end of such devastating judgment. "Your Grace," she whispered, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Perhaps that is sufficient." Duke Nathaniel's steel-blue eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You would speak in defense of those who showed you no mercy, Miss Moore. I would speak against cruelty, Your Grace, regardless of its direction." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around the table, the assembled guests watched in stunned silence as a servant dared to question the actions of a duke. But Catherine had moved beyond fear into a realm where principle mattered more than consequences. Duke Nathaniel studied her face for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or possibly respect. "You believe my treatment of these guests to be cruel?" "I believe," Catherine said carefully, "that exposing people's private failures for public humiliation is cruel regardless of the circumstances that prompted it. They were wrong to treat me as they did, but matching cruelty with cruelty solves nothing." The observation struck the room like lightning. In defending her tormentors, Catherine had demonstrated a moral courage that elevated her above every person present. She had shown that true nobility lay not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the strength to rise above the desire for revenge. Duke Nathaniel's response was unexpected. Instead of anger at being challenged by a servant, his lips curved into what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You are quite right, Miss Moore," he said quietly. "I have allowed my anger at their treatment of you to drive me toward behavior that is beneath the standards I expect from myself." He turned back to his guests, who sat in various states of shock and humiliation, their earlier confidence completely shattered. "You have all been exposed tonight as people whose private failures far exceed any fault you found in Miss Moore. But she, with greater wisdom than I initially showed, reminds us that cruelty in response to cruelty diminishes us all." The Duke moved to his position at the head of the table, his bearing once again perfectly controlled. "You came to my home as guests and chose to abuse that privilege by tormenting an innocent woman. You have been shown the consequences of such behavior. Now you will leave my house and never return to it." Lady Pemberton attempted one final protest. "Your Grace, surely—" "There is no surely, madam. You have revealed your true characters tonight, and they are characters I do not wish to associate with in the future. You will go now, and you will speak of tonight's events to no one, lest you wish to have your own failures become public knowledge throughout London society." As the disgraced guests began their humiliating exodus from Blackwood Hall, Catherine remained standing by the dining table, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had transpired. She had been defended by a duke, elevated by her own moral courage, and somehow transformed from victim to victor without seeking revenge. But as the last carriage disappeared into the night, Catherine realized that her life had been irrevocably changed. She could never again be simply a servant in this house, not after what had passed between herself and Duke Nathaniel tonight. The question now was what she would become instead. In the aftermath of the disastrous dinner party, Blackwood Hall settled into an uneasy quiet that seemed to permeate every room and corridor. The servants moved through their duties with unusual subdued attention, fully aware that something unprecedented had occurred in the dining room, though the exact details remained shrouded in whispers and speculation. Catherine found herself unable to return to the comfortable invisibility that had previously defined her existence in the household. Every servant regarded her with a mixture of awe and wariness, uncertain how to interact with someone who had been publicly defended by the Duke himself against members of the peerage. Mrs. Hartwell, the head housekeeper, maintained a chilly distance that spoke volumes about her disapproval of any disruption to the established order. More troubling still were the frequent summons to Duke Nathaniel's study over the following weeks. What had begun as brief conversations about household matters gradually evolved into lengthy discussions that ranged across literature, politics, philosophy, and social reform. Catherine discovered that the Duke possessed not only the brilliant intellect she had heard rumored, but also a passionate interest in questions of justice and human equality that aligned remarkably with her own carefully hidden convictions. "Miss Moore," he said during one such conversation, as autumn light filtered through the tall windows of his private study, "you mentioned yesterday that you had read Mill's work on political economy. I confess myself curious about your thoughts on his arguments regarding the education of the working classes." Catherine looked up from the tea service she had been arranging, startled as always by the Duke's willingness to engage her in intellectual discourse. "I found his arguments compelling, Your Grace, though I suspect his optimism about human nature may be somewhat naive." "In what sense?" "Mr. Mill assumes that people will naturally support the education and elevation of their social inferiors once they understand the benefits to society as a whole. But what I witnessed in your dining room suggests that many people derive genuine pleasure from maintaining others in subordinate positions. Education of the lower classes threatens not just economic interests, but psychological ones as well." Duke Nathaniel set down his pen, giving her observation his complete attention. "You believe that cruelty serves a psychological function for those who practice it?" "I believe," Catherine said carefully, "that maintaining a sense of superiority requires the existence of people one can consider inferior. Remove that source of comparison, and some individuals would be forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own limitations." The observation hung between them with uncomfortable accuracy. Both recognized that their growing intellectual intimacy was itself a threat to the social order that had previously defined their respective positions in the world. "Miss Moore," the Duke said finally, "what if I were to tell you that I have been considering establishing a school for the children of my tenants? A proper school with qualified instructors and a curriculum that would prepare them for advancement rather than simply maintaining their current stations." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Such a project would be revolutionary in its implications, challenging the very foundations of the social system that kept the poor in perpetual servitude. "I would say, Your Grace, that such a school would face enormous opposition from those who benefit from the current system. And I would also say," she paused, gathering courage for what she knew was an extraordinary presumption, "that you would need someone to help design the curriculum who understands both the needs of the students and the realities they face." Their eyes met across the study, and Catherine saw in the Duke's steel-blue gaze a recognition that matched her own. They were no longer simply master and servant engaging in pleasant conversation. They had become collaborators in a vision that could transform the lives of hundreds of families, but their growing partnership was not invisible to the rest of the household. Mrs. Hartwell's disapproving reports had reached London, carried by dismissed servants and travelling merchants who thrived on gossip. Within a fortnight of the infamous dinner party, whispers began circulating through London's drawing rooms about Duke Nathaniel's inappropriate fascination with his servant. The crisis came to a head when the Duke's sister, Lady Margaret Thornfield, arrived unannounced at Blackwood Hall with her husband and a determination to address what she termed this scandalous situation before it destroyed the family's reputation. "Nathaniel," she announced without preamble as she swept into his study where Catherine was helping organize correspondence for the proposed school, "I have come to save you from yourself." Duke Nathaniel rose from his desk with the controlled grace that marked all his movements, but Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders. "Margaret, how delightful. I trust your journey from London was pleasant." Lady Margaret's sharp eyes fixed immediately upon Catherine, taking in every detail of her appearance and demeanor with the precision of a general assessing enemy fortifications. "Is this the servant who has caused such a sensation?" The one you so dramatically defended against Lord Pemberton and his associates? This is Miss Moore, the Duke replied evenly. And yes, she was subjected to unconscionable treatment by my former guests. Treatment I could not in good conscience allow to continue. Could not in good conscience, Lady Margaret repeated, her voice dripping with sophisticated disdain. How noble. Tell me, Nathaniel, does your conscience also approve of the gossip now spreading through every fashionable household in London? Does it approve of the speculation about your relationship with this person? Catherine felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of Lady Margaret's words sank in. The defense that had seemed so noble and principled in the moment was now being twisted into something sordid and scandalous. Margaret, Duke Nathaniel's voice carried a warning that would have silenced most people, but his sister was made of sterner stuff. No, Nathaniel, you will listen to me. Our family has held its position for 3 centuries through careful attention to reputation and social responsibility. You cannot throw that away for a romantic infatuation with a servant, no matter how pretty or accomplished she might be. This conversation is inappropriate and will cease immediately, the Duke commanded, but Lady Margaret pressed on with the determination of someone convinced of her moral authority. Inappropriate? I'll tell you what's inappropriate. A Duke of the realm spending hours in private conversation with a housemaid, discussing literature and politics as if she were a social equal, planning projects together as if she were a partner rather than an employee. Each accusation struck home with devastating accuracy because each was essentially true. Catherine realized with growing horror that her innocent conversations with the Duke could indeed be interpreted as evidence of improper intimacy. Furthermore, Lady Margaret continued relentlessly, the servants are talking, the dismissed guests are talking, and soon all of London will be talking about Duke Nathaniel Blackwood's unprecedented attachment to his domestic staff. Lord Thornfield, who had remained silent throughout his wife's attack, finally spoke with the measured tones of a man accustomed to legal precision. Nathaniel, you must understand the position this places you in. Questions are already being raised about your fitness for your parliamentary seat, your social obligations, your duty to the family name. Duke Nathaniel's face had hardened into an expression Catherine had never seen before. Cold fury mixed with something that might have been pain. Are you suggesting, Margaret, that my duty to our family name requires me to treat those beneath my social station with cruelty and contempt? I am suggesting, Lady Margaret replied with steel in her voice, that your duty requires you to maintain appropriate boundaries and relationships. This woman, she gestured dismissively toward Catherine, has clearly bewitched you into forgetting your position and responsibilities. Catherine could bear no more. The scene unfolding before her was a nightmare variation of the dining room humiliation, but somehow worse, because it involved people who loved Duke Nathaniel and genuinely believed they were acting in his best interests. Your Grace, she said quietly, perhaps I should withdraw. You will remain exactly where you are, Duke Nathaniel commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. Then, more gently, you are part of this conversation because it concerns you as much as it concerns me. The simple statement fell like a thunderbolt in the study. By insisting that Catherine remain to hear discussions about his reputation and family obligations, Duke Nathaniel was elevating her to a status that no servant could legitimately claim. Lady Margaret's eyes widened with shock and dismay. Nathaniel, you cannot mean to include a servant in family deliberations. The suggestion is that Miss Moore's welfare and future are intimately connected with my own, the Duke interrupted with devastating clarity. That her reputation and mine are now inseparably linked. That what affects one of us affects both of us. The admission hung in the air like a confession that changed everything. Duke Nathaniel had just acknowledged before witnesses that his relationship with Catherine transcended every boundary that society deemed appropriate between master and servant. Lady Margaret sank into a chair, her face white with shock. My God, Nathaniel, you're in love with her. The silence that followed Lady Margaret's stark pronouncement seemed to stretch into eternity. Catherine felt her world tilt on its axis as the unspoken truth that had been growing between herself and the Duke was dragged into the harsh light of acknowledgement. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for him to deny it, to clarify that his concern was purely humanitarian, to restore the safe boundaries that had made their conversations possible. Instead, Duke Nathaniel turned to look directly at Catherine, his steel blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it impossible to breathe. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." The admission hit the room like a physical force. Lord Thornfield dropped his head into his hands with a groan of despair, while Lady Margaret made a sound that was half sob, half gasp of outrage. "Nathaniel, no," she whispered. "You cannot. Think of what this means. Think of what you would lose." But Duke Nathaniel's attention remained fixed on Catherine, whose face had gone white with shock. "Miss Moore," he said gently, "I believe you deserve to know that my feelings for you extend far beyond appropriate concern for a member of my household. They have done so for weeks, though I was perhaps too much a coward to acknowledge them, even to myself." Catherine's hands trembled as she gripped the back of a chair for support. "Your Grace, this is impossible. You must know it's impossible." "Must I?" His voice carried a note of challenge that made her pulse quicken. "I know it's unprecedented. I know it violates every social convention we have been taught to respect. But impossible? That remains to be seen." Lady Margaret struggled to her feet, her face flushed with a mixture of panic and determination. "Nathaniel, listen to yourself. You're talking about destroying everything our family has built. Your position, your influence, your ability to do good in the world, all of it will be forfeit if you pursue this madness." "And what of Miss Moore's ability to do good in the world?" Duke Nathaniel asked quietly. "What of her intelligence, her compassion, her moral courage? Are those qualities worthless simply because she lacks a title?" "They are worthless," Lady Margaret said desperately, "because society will never accept them. You could marry the daughter of a duke and barely maintain your social standing after the scandal of that dinner party, but this would make you a pariah, an object of ridicule and contempt." Catherine found her voice at last, though it came out barely above a whisper. "She's right, Your Grace. You must see that she's right." Duke Nathaniel turned back to her, his expression a mixture of hope and anguish. "What I see, Miss Moore, is a woman whose wisdom and character surpass anyone I have ever encountered in London's drawing rooms. What I see is the possibility of a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than political alliance and social convenience." "You see a fantasy," Catherine said, her voice growing stronger despite the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. "A beautiful, impossible fantasy that would destroy us both." "Would it?" He moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes. "Or would it be the foundation of something real and worthwhile in a world built on pretense and empty convention?" Lord Thornfield finally raised his head, his expression grave. "Nathaniel, even if your feelings are genuine, even if Miss Moore returns them, the practical obstacles are insurmountable. No church would perform such a ceremony. No social circle would accept it. Your children would be ostracized, your political career would end, and the family name would become a byword for scandal." "The family name," Duke Nathaniel repeated slowly. "Tell me, Charles, what exactly has our family name accomplished in the past century? What great causes have we championed? What meaningful change have we brought to the world?" "We have maintained our position," Lady Margaret said desperately. "We have preserved our estates, our influence, our standing. For what purpose?" The question cracked through the room like a whip. "So that we might continue to maintain them for another century, so that future generations might have the privilege of attending the same empty social gatherings, engaging in the same meaningless conversations, perpetuating the same cruel distinctions that allow people to be judged by their bloodlines rather than their character." Catherine could bear no more. The passionate idealism in Duke Nathaniel's voice, the genuine anguish on Lady Margaret's face, the impossible situation that offered no solution without devastating consequences. It was all too much. "Stop," she said, her voice cutting through the argument with surprising authority. "All of you, please stop." The three aristocrats turned to look at her, perhaps suddenly remembering that the servant they were discussing was actually present in the room. Catherine drew herself up to her full height, gathering every ounce of dignity and courage she possessed. "Your Grace, I am deeply honored by your feelings, more honored than you could possibly know, but I cannot and will not be the cause of your destruction." "Catherine," Duke Nathaniel began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "My lord, you have shown me kindness beyond anything I had a right to expect. You have defended my honor, valued my thoughts, and offered me respect that society would never require you to give. But Lady Margaret is correct about the consequences of pursuing this path." She turned to face Lady Margaret directly. "My lady, you are also correct that I am completely unsuitable as a duke's wife. But you are wrong about one thing. I have not bewitched your brother or manipulated him in any way. His feelings, if they truly exist, have developed despite my attempts to maintain appropriate boundaries. Finally, she looked back at Duke Nathaniel, her heart breaking at the anguish she saw in his eyes. Your Grace, you spoke of doing good in the world, of using your position to create meaningful change. That school you wish to establish, the reforms you hope to champion, these things matter more than any personal happiness we might find together. Do they? He asked quietly. What good can I do if I sacrifice my integrity to maintain my position? What meaningful change can I create if I compromise my principles for the sake of social acceptance? Catherine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Then we must find a different way, a way that allows you to follow your conscience without destroying your ability to help others. Lady Margaret looked between them with dawning hope. How you would leave? You would remove yourself from this situation? I would do whatever is necessary to protect those I care about, Catherine replied simply. Duke Nathaniel's face went white. No, I will not allow you to sacrifice yourself to preserve my social standing. If society cannot accept what we offer, then perhaps it is society that needs to change, not us. And perhaps, Catherine said with infinite gentleness, that change will come in time, but it will not come today, and we cannot force it through scandal and defiance. Sometimes the greatest courage lies in choosing the harder path that serves the greater good. The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over them. In that moment, Catherine Moore demonstrated a nobility of spirit that transcended any title or birthright. She was choosing to protect the man she loved by walking away from him, understanding that sometimes love requires sacrifice rather than fulfillment. Duke Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment, seeing in her face the same moral courage that had first captured his attention and admiration. Finally, he nodded slowly, though every line of his body spoke of a man surrendering his most precious dream. Then we do this properly, he said at last, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. With honor and dignity, not through secretive departures or whispered scandal. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Miss Catherine Moore's Academy for Young Ladies, illuminating the eager faces of 30 students from merchant and professional families, who were receiving an education that rivaled anything offered to the daughters of the nobility. The school, established through an anonymous endowment that had appeared just months after Catherine's departure from Blackwood Hall, had become renowned throughout England for its innovative curriculum and exceptional standards. Catherine moved between the desks where her students worked on translations of French poetry, offering gentle corrections and encouraging observations. At 27, she had found a purpose that filled her days with meaning, even as her heart remained marked by loss. The girls in her care would never face the limitations that had once circumscribed her own life. They would enter the world equipped with education, confidence, and the belief that their worth was not determined by the circumstances of their birth. Miss Moore, called young Elizabeth Hartwell, the daughter of a successful barrister, I don't understand why the poet chose such melancholy imagery to describe love. Surely love should be described in happier terms. Catherine paused, her hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. Sometimes, my dear, the deepest love carries with it a touch of sadness. Love that requires sacrifice, or love that cannot be fully expressed, often produces the most beautiful and meaningful art. Through the tall windows, Catherine caught sight of a familiar figure on horseback, riding slowly past the school, as he had done every few weeks for the past 2 years. Duke Nathaniel never approached the building, or attempted to communicate with her directly, but his regular appearances told her that he had not forgotten their connection, even as he honored her request to maintain distance. From the local newspapers and occasional letters from former colleagues, Catherine knew that the Duke had thrown himself into his political and social reform work with renewed passion. The school for tenant children had been established with great success, and his speeches in Parliament on behalf of workers' rights and educational reform had earned him both fierce opponents and devoted allies. He had become exactly what she had hoped, a force for positive change who used his position and influence to improve the lives of others. Miss Moore, Elizabeth's voice drew her attention back to the classroom. Are you quite well? You look rather sad yourself. Catherine smiled, though she felt the familiar ache that always accompanied thoughts of what might have been. I am quite well, Elizabeth. Sometimes grown-ups simply have complicated feelings about beautiful things. After dismissing her students for the day, Catherine remained in her empty classroom to prepare lessons for the following week. The work had become her refuge, demanding enough to occupy her mind while meaningful enough to satisfy her need to make a difference in the world. A soft knock at the door interrupted her planning. "We're closed for the day," she called out, assuming it was a parent arriving late to collect a child. "Miss Moore?" The voice was unfamiliar, a young woman with a refined accent. "Might I speak with you briefly?" Catherine opened the door to find a lady of perhaps 22, elegantly dressed but with kind eyes and an earnest expression that suggested genuine purpose rather than idle curiosity. "I am Miss Penelope Fairfax," the young woman announced. "My father is Lord Fairfax, and I've come to ask if you might consider expanding your school to include instruction for adults." Catherine studied her unexpected visitor with interest. "Adults, Miss Fairfax? What sort of instruction?" "Reading and writing primarily for women who never had the opportunity to learn. Servant girls, factory workers, the wives of laborers, women whose circumstances prevented them from receiving any education." Miss Fairfax's voice grew more passionate as she explained her vision. "I know it's unconventional, but I believe such a program could change countless lives." "It would indeed be unconventional," Catherine agreed slowly. "Such a program would face enormous opposition from those who believe education should be limited to specific social classes." "Yes," Miss Fairfax said with determination that reminded Catherine of someone else she knew. "But some battles are worth fighting, don't you think? Especially when one has the resources and position to make a real difference." Catherine felt something stir within her, a recognition of kindred spirit and shared purpose. "Tell me more about this program, Miss Fairfax. Who would fund such an endeavor? Who would support it against the inevitable criticism?" Miss Fairfax's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "There is a gentleman of considerable influence who has expressed interest in supporting educational reform. He believes that real social progress requires lifting up those who have been denied opportunities, rather than simply maintaining existing hierarchies." Something in the young woman's manner, a careful precision in how she described this anonymous benefactor, made Catherine's pulse quicken. "This gentleman, does he have experience with educational initiatives?" "Oh, yes," Miss Fairfax replied, with what might have been a carefully innocent expression. "He recently established a very successful school for children in a rural county. The project has become a model for similar efforts throughout England." Catherine's breath caught as the implications became clear. "Miss Fairfax, what is your connection to this mysterious gentleman?" The young woman smiled, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking to reveal genuine warmth. "Duke Nathaniel Blackwood is my cousin, Miss Moore, and he has spoken of you with such admiration and respect that I felt compelled to see for myself the remarkable woman who inspired his dedication to educational reform." The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. For 2 years she had maintained her distance, believing that separation was necessary for both their sakes. Now she discovered that Duke Nathaniel had found a way to remain connected to her work, to support her mission indirectly, while respecting the boundaries she had established. "Miss Fairfax," Catherine said carefully, "why has your cousin sent you to me? What does he hope to accomplish?" "He hasn't sent me precisely," Miss Fairfax admitted. "I came on my own initiative, though with his knowledge. You see, Miss Moore, I have watched my cousin become a man transformed over the past 2 years. His work on behalf of social reform has given him purpose and meaning, but it has also made him a target for those who oppose change." Catherine felt a chill of concern. "What do you mean?" "There have been attempts to discredit him, to suggest that his reform efforts are motivated by personal instability rather than genuine conviction. Whispers about his past associations, questions about his judgment, suggestions that he has become too radical for his own good." The implications were clear and terrifying. The very work that Catherine had hoped Duke Nathaniel would pursue was now being used against him by his enemies. "Miss Fairfax," Catherine said slowly, "what are you asking of me?" The young woman took a deep breath, clearly gathering courage for what she was about to say. "I am asking if you might consider the possibility that 2 people of principle, working together openly and honestly, might accomplish more good in the world than either could achieve alone." Catherine's hands trembled as the meaning of the proposal sank in. "Your cousin would risk everything again, after 2 years of building his reputation as a reformer?" "My cousin," Miss Fairfax said gently, "believes that a man without personal integrity cannot create lasting social change. He believes that hiding his deepest convictions, even for the sake of political expediency, ultimately undermines everything he hopes to accomplish." Catherine moved to the window, looking out at the garden where her students often took their lessons on pleasant days. The life she had built was meaningful and fulfilling, but it was also safe and solitary. The possibility Miss Fairfax offered would change everything for both herself and Duke Nathaniel. The opposition would be fierce, Catherine said finally. The scandal would be enormous. Yes, Miss Fairfax agreed, but the alternative is living a lie, pretending that social conventions matter more than genuine affection and shared purpose. And I have come to believe, Miss Moore, that sometimes the most radical thing one can do is simply tell the truth. Catherine thought of the girls she taught, the bright minds she helped shape, the future leaders and reformers she was preparing for a world that desperately needed their contributions. What would she tell them about the importance of following their convictions when their own happiness was at stake? "Miss Fairfax," she said at last, turning back to face her visitor, "would you be so kind as to deliver a message to your cousin for me?" "Of course," Catherine smiled, feeling for the first time in 2 years that the future held possibilities she had not dared to imagine. "Tell him that Miss Catherine Moore would very much like to discuss the establishment of his adult education program, and tell him that she believes some partnerships are worth any amount of scandal they might provoke." Miss Fairfax's face broke into a radiant smile. "I shall deliver that message with the greatest pleasure, Miss Moore. And might I add that I believe my cousin has shown exceptional judgment in his choice of partner?" As Catherine watched Miss Fairfax's carriage disappear down the tree-lined road, she felt her heart soar with a joy she had thought lost forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles, and undoubtedly new opposition from those who could not imagine love transcending social boundaries. But it would also bring the possibility of standing beside the man she loved in the fight for a more just and equitable world, united not just by affection, but by shared conviction that some principles were worth any sacrifice to uphold. The future had suddenly become far more complicated and infinitely more beautiful. If you want more stories like this video and subscribe to support the channel.